Hello and welcome. You're listening to Interesting History for Sleep, the calm corner of the internet, where fascinating true stories are told in a way that helps you wind down, drift off, or just relax at the end of your day. Tonight's episode is called The Outlaw Lovers Who Defied America, the remarkable story of Bonnie and Clyde. Przedomich na Polski before we begin. Tell me, what time are you listening to this? Is it PM? Midnight? AM? Maybe you're just here to relax after a long day, or you've got headphones in, hoping for a little peace. Let me know in the comments. And now, let's begin. Let me tell you how it all began. Not with fireworks or a grand moment, but with something small, something gentle. Like a soft breeze passing through the warm streets of West Dallas. A tea was the kind of evening when the sun dipped low and everything turned gold. The porches were quiet. The wind was slow. And in that stillness, two lives slowly started to lean toward each other. Bonnie was a young woman who liked quiet things. She wrote poems in the margins of old notebooks. She watched the sky with thoughtful eyes. She worked in a small diner, pouring coffee, listening to stories, and walking home with pie wrapped in napkins. Her heart was full of dreams that stretched far beyond the streets she knew. Clyde was nearby, living his own quiet life. He wasn't rich. He wasn't famous. But there was something thoughtful in the way he moved. He helped where he could, fixed things that were broken, and kept his eyes on the horizon more than most people did. He had made mistakes, small ones, but his heart still held a kind of hope. Clyde liked things that worked. He liked engines, wheels, tools that felt solid in the hand. He didn't talk too much, but when he did, his words were careful, almost kind. Not the kind of kind that's loud, the quiet kind. The kind that notices when someone looks tired, or when someone needs help lifting something heavy. Bonnie, in her own way, also looked for quiet truths. She noticed how the light changed in the afternoon. She remembered the names of regulars at the diner and how they took their tea. She liked music, not the kind that shouted, but the kind that hummed low and slow through the radio while she worked. One evening, their paths crossed, not in a loud way. It happened at a friend's house. Bonnie came by for a cup of coffee and a little company. Clyde was already there, leaning against a doorway, listening more than he spoke. They saw each other, and that was enough. Not many words were exchanged that night. Just a simple hello, a quiet laugh, a shared moment in the kitchen where the noise of others faded into the background. There was no rush, just a feeling, like something had shifted, even if they didn't yet know what. Bonnie remembered Clyde's hands, how he held his cup with care, how he listened without interrupting. Clyde remembered the way Bonnie's eyes moved when she smiled, like she was still half inside her own thoughts. When Bonnie walked home that night, she didn't write in her notebook. She just laid on her bed with the lights off, looking at the ceiling, thinking about the boy with quiet eyes. She didn't tell anyone. There was nothing to explain yet. Clyde stayed out a little longer, sitting on the porch steps, watching the stars. He didn't speak. He just let the quiet hold him. Neither of them told anyone. It wasn't a story to share yet. It was just a beginning. A very quiet one, but sometimes the quietest beginnings hold the strongest stories. This was the start of theirs. Let me tell you how it began to unfold. Slowly, like a soft breeze moving across a still lake. After their first meeting, Bonnie and Clyde began to see more of each other. Not in a rush, not in a whirlwind, just little by little, like the start of a quiet melody. They would bump into each other in town, sometimes by accident, sometimes not. A smile here, a wave there. And then came the small conversations. On porches, by doorways, under trees that whispered in the wind. The days were warm, and the air carried a kind of calm that let their connection grow without force. Bonnie, with her notebook never far from reach, started writing a little differently. The lines were softer, the words more curious. Clyde, who had always looked at the world with a kind of steady wariness, now had moments where he simply stopped and noticed the color of the sky, or the way the light touched her hair. They began taking walks, short ones at first, down gravel paths lined with fences, through small fields where the grass brushed at their ankles. They didn't talk about big things. They didn't need to. Their quiet talks were made of small wonders. A bird that hopped beside them for a while, a cloud shaped like a rabbit, the sound of distant laughter from another street. Time moved gently around them. They weren't in a hurry, and the world, for a while, seemed to give them space. Bonnie still worked at the diner. She poured coffee, refilled cream, and listened to the radio playing behind the counter. But now she looked forward to the end of her shift. Sometimes Clyde would be waiting outside. Other times he'd leave a note tucked in her apron pocket. Just a sentence or two. Something kind. Something true. Clyde spent his days helping his family, fixing things, moving things, and finding work where he could. But his thoughts wandered more than they used to. They wandered toward her. There was no promise spoken, no grand confession, just the kind of closeness that grows from looking at the same part of the sky and not needing to say a word. People in town began to notice, not with disapproval, but with knowing smiles. They could see what was unfolding. It was soft and real. One evening, Clyde brought Bonnie a small bunch of wildflowers. He didn't say where he found them. She didn't ask. She just placed them in a jar by her bed and looked at them before falling asleep. Another evening, they sat on a bench beneath a quiet tree. The air was still. The stars were just beginning to show. Bonnie leaned her head on Clyde's shoulder, and for a long, long while, they didn't say a thing. They began to meet more often, on slow afternoons or quiet mornings. At first, always in public. Later, when the sun dipped lower, they'd find still corners of the world to sit together. Clyde started to learn her favorite things, how she liked her tea, the songs that made, her smile, the way she tucked her hair behind one ear when she was thinking. And Bonnie noticed the way Clyde studied the world around him, how he liked to fix what was broken, how he always paused before answering a question. These were days of early wonder, of soft discovery, of two people letting their guards fall without realizing. There was a gentleness to them in those days, like two birds slowly learning to fly in rhythm, not rushing, not pulling, just learning the quiet pattern of togetherness. And this was just the beginning. Clyde faces small troubles with the law. Bonnie writes in her notebook, watching quietly from the sidelines. They remain close. Every quiet story meets its edge, a place where peace rubs gently against the restlessness of the world. That edge came slowly for Bonnie and Clyde. It didn't shout. It whispered. Clyde had always known that trouble followed close behind him, not because he wanted it, but because he didn't always know how to keep it away. He had tried to stay on the right path. He worked where he could. He kept to himself. But jobs were hard to find, and some doors stayed shut, no matter how gently he knocked. One afternoon, the knock came to him. A sheriff's car rolled slowly past where Clyde stood fixing a neighbor's fence. It stopped just long enough for a look to be exchanged, silent and sharp. Clyde knew that look. He had seen it before. It said, "We haven't forgotten that night." Bonnie found him sitting on her porch. The sun had long since set, and the only light came from a lamp flickering through the window. He didn't speak at first, just looked down at his hands. He had been picked up earlier that week for something small. Nothing violent, nothing loud, just something the Low remembered. An old charge, still hanging in the air. He hadn't told her yet. He wasn't sure how. Bonnie listened, the way she always did, with quiet eyes and patient stillness. She didn't interrupt. She didn't question. When he finished, she reached for his hand. "It's not who you are," she said, and maybe that's what mattered more than anything. The next few days were quieter than usual. They still met, still walked, but there was something else in the air now. A feeling like the wind had changed direction. They knew the world was watching, even if only from a distance. Bonnie began writing again. Not just poems now, but little thoughts she tucked into letters she never sent. She wrote about fear, about courage, about how sometimes two people find each other just before the storm, and Clyde, for his part, stayed close. He didn't run, not yet. He wasn't ready. He wanted to hold on to the life they had built in whispers and long afternoons, but something inside him also knew the quiet wouldn't last forever. The edge had been reached, and soon their steps would have to carry them farther than the town would allow, not because they wanted to go, but because there was no longer any place to stay. Clyde had been careful, but not careful enough. It happened one afternoon. A knock at the door, a voice calling his name, and then the sound of footsteps on wooden floors. There wasn't a chase. There wasn't time. He was taken quietly. Just like that, the calm they had held on to was shaken. Bonnie stood outside the jail the next morning, holding a small brown bag with a sandwich, a book, and a folded napkin. She wasn't allowed to see him. Not yet. But she waited anyway. She sat on the bench outside for a long time, her fingers tracing circles on the wooden seat. Inside, Clyde sat in a small cell with bars that stretched high above him. The walls were gray. The light was dim. He thought about Bonnie, about the quiet afternoons they had shared, about how quickly the world had changed when she was finally allowed in. They didn't cry. They didn't raise their voices. They simply sat across from each other, hands almost touching on the table between them. Bonnie slid the folded napkin toward him. On the inside, written in her small, steady hand, were 5 words: "I'm not going anywhere, Clyde." From that day on, Bonnie visited as often as she could. She brought books. She brought letters. She brought the sound of the world outside. And together, without ever saying it directly, they began to plan. It wasn't grand. It wasn't loud. But it was theirs. Clyde began to study every sound inside the jail. The timing of footsteps. The turning of keys. The way shadows moved when the guards passed by. Bonnie listened to conversations in the diner, noticed when talk of security became casual, when people stopped paying close attention. They didn't speak of escape openly, but in their silence. Plans began to grow, and one morning, before the sun had fully risen, Clyde was gone. And no one knew how. Not at first. There was no sign of struggle, no sound of alarm, just an empty space where he had been. Some said someone helped him from the outside. Some said he simply walked out like a shadow. Bonnie never explained. By the time the town stirred, Bonnie and Clyde were already miles away. They didn't run fast. They didn't laugh loudly. They drove quietly through early light, past fields and fences, past trees just beginning to bloom. The plan had worked, but more than that, the promise had held. The one Bonnie had written on that napkin. She hadn't gone anywhere, and now, together again, they moved forward into the unknown, 1 mile at a time, one quiet breath after another. When Bonnie and Clyde left town, they didn't speed away. They didn't shout or leave anything behind in pieces. They simply drove, slowly, silently. As the early morning light reached over the hills and touched the fields, they slipped onto the open road like a sigh carried by the wind. There was no map, no clear plan, just movement. Forward. Together, the car hummed beneath them, a sound steady and low, like a lullaby made of wheels and asphalt. Outside the windows, the world passed. By in soft colors green fields, wooden fences, quiet ponds where birds floated without care, Bonnie leaned her head against the window. The glass was cool. Her breath made little clouds on the surface. Sometimes she traced shapes into them with her finger. Hearts, stars, letters that faded almost as soon as she wrote them. Clyde kept his hands on the wheel. His eyes moved from the road to the sky, always watching, always thinking. But his shoulders weren't tense the way they used to be. Something about the open road had loosened them. Just a little. They stopped when they needed to at old gas stations where the pumps ticked slowly, at roadside stands selling apples and bread. They spoke softly, paid in coins, moved on. Some nights they slept under trees. Other nights they found places no one used anymore, a barn with a missing door, a cabin without windows, an abandoned church where the pews still smelled of dust and wood. Bonnie started writing again. Not just poems, but thoughts. Simple ones. About the color of the morning sky. About the way Clyde always checked her door twice before he went to sleep. About how, even while hiding, they were seeing more of the world than most people ever would. They didn't talk much about what they had left behind. They didn't make promises about what was ahead. They stayed in the middle, in the present. In the hush between one town and the next, one afternoon, they drove by a wide lake. The water was still. Bonnie asked if they could stop. They sat at the edge, shoes off, toes dipped in. Birds circled overhead, and the wind touched their hair gently, like it knew them. Clyde picked up a flat stone and skipped it across the surface. It danced 3 times, then disappeared. Bonnie smiled. Not bad, he shrugged. I've had practice. There was laughter in that moment, light and real. And they held on to it, like people hold on to sunlight on cold days. They were 2 on the road now, not lost, not running, just moving through the quiet world in a way that felt slow, soft, and for now free. They knew the world would catch up, that the road would grow harder. But for now, they had wind, sky, and each other, and sometimes that's all a person needs. The road stretched out before them, long and winding. Some days it curved through low hills and thick trees. Other days it rolled through wide fields and empty plains. But no matter where it went, it always brought Bonnie and Clyde somewhere new. Somewhere quiet. They passed through towns with names that sounded like lullabies. Whispering Pines, Stillwater, Willow Creek. Towns where the streets were sleepy, the windows were dusty, and the wind moved slowly between shutters and doorways. In one town, they found a tiny white church with no sign out front. The doors were open, and a soft breeze carried in the scent of old wood and sunlight. They sat on the back pew, not to pray, just to rest. The stillness inside was almost like music. In another place, they found a park bench beneath a tree that dropped little yellow leaves onto their shoulders. Bonnie collected a few and placed them between the pages of her notebook. Later, she would write about that moment, the way the wind felt, The way Clyde brushed a leaf from her hair. The way silence sometimes feels like safety. They stayed in barns when they could. Farmers sometimes let them sleep in the hayloft without questions. They paid with small chores. Feeding animals. Fixing a gate. Mending something that had been broken too long. One farmer gave them soup. Another gave them a blanket. One simply nodded and said, "Safe travels," before turning back to his fields. And always Bonnie wrote. Small lines. Short poems. A sentence. Scribbled while sitting on a fence post. A verse added in candlelight before sleep. Clyde didn't write, but he remembered. The faces. The trees. The stars in each town that looked just a little different. He remembered the roads that felt easy, and the ones that felt like they were holding their breath. They didn't stay long in any place. They never unpacked fully. But in each stop, they left something behind. A thank you. A kind word. A memory. One evening, they sat by a riverbank as the sun dipped low. Fireflies began to flicker near the reeds, blinking like little stars that had fallen to earth. Bonnie whispered, "If I could live in a moment, it might be this one." Clyde didn't answer. He just reached out and held her hand. In these towns, they weren't criminals. They weren't outlaws. They were just people passing through. Two souls sharing the road, the sky, and the silence, and as they drove away. From each town, Clyde would glance in the mirror, watching it shrink behind them. Sometimes Bonnie would wave, even if no one was watching, because it felt good to say goodbye gently, and so they moved on. Through more quiet towns, more open fields, carried forward by a road that never stopped, and a love that had learned how to live in the spaces between everything else. After weeks on the road, the quiet life Bonnie and Clyde had carved out began to shift. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't loud. But it started, like most things in their life, in silence. Clyde's older brother, Buck, had heard whispers of where they might be, and when he found them, he didn't bring questions. He brought company. He brought trust. He brought Blanche, his wife, who was as careful and kind as the wind through the trees. At first, the four of them simply shared space. A borrowed cabin. A stretch of time. Bonnie and Blanche would cook simple meals: soup, beans, bread warmed on a pan, and sit by the window as the men cleaned their clothes or fixed up the car. There was laughter now, more than before. Quiet, but real. The kind of laughter that happens when people feel safe, even just for a little while. But with Buck came stories. Stories of jobs, of robberies done by others, of banks far from the reach of regular townsfolk. Clyde listened. Quietly. He didn't lean forward. But he didn't turn away either. They needed money. That much was clear. Not for greed. Not for show. Just for gas. For food. For enough to keep moving. To keep Bonnie safe. To keep them all from having to turn back. And slowly, the gang began to form. Not with ceremony. Not with shouts. Just with understanding. Clyde knew how to drive. Buck knew how to handle pressure. Bonnie, sharp as ever, could read a room with just a glance. And Blanche kept things calm when nerves ran high. They weren't wild. They weren't careless. They were careful, thoughtful. Quiet in their plans, they would scout small places. Avoid big ones. Never stay too long. Always thank those who helped them. But as their steps grew more sure, so did the weight of them. The world outside their small group began to notice. Not all at once. Just a whisper in a paper here. A question at a gas station there. Still, they pressed on. Sometimes they celebrated the smallest things. A good day with no trouble. a warm loaf of bread, a clean place to rest. They played cards by lamplight. They hummed old songs from the radio. They shared blankets when the nights grew cold. It wasn't a gang, really. Not how the world would come to see it. It was a family, stitched together by necessity and choice. A family trying to survive in a world that didn't give them many chances. And though they didn't say it out loud, each of them knew this moment of peace wouldn't last. But they held it anyway. Like breath. Like a photograph taken in stillness. Because sometimes even the most fragile things are worth holding on to. In the middle of their long journey, between dusty roads and slow-moving days, there was a moment that would follow Bonnie and Clyde long after they were gone. It began in a small house tucked behind a gas station. It had been empty for years, but it kept the rain out and gave them warmth. They stayed there for a few days resting, reading, cleaning clothes, and simply breathing. During that time, someone found an old camera tucked away in a drawer. Maybe it belonged to the last person who lived there. Maybe it had been waiting just for them. Clyde wiped the dust from the lens. Bonnie, with her curiosity shining, wanted to see how it worked. They set it on a chair and took a few pictures. Nothing fancy, just the four of them laughing. Buck and Blanche sitting on the steps, Clyde leaning against the car, and Bonnie standing tall, one hand on her hip, the other holding a cigar Clyde had been teasing her with. She had smiled in that photo, not because she wanted to make a statement, not because she was trying to be something. She had smiled because they were all safe for once. Fed. Rested. Together, they developed the photos using a small kit Clyde had found in town. The prints came out soft and grainy, like memories you could hold in your hand. Bonnie tucked a few into her notebook. Clyde put one in the glove box. Buck left one on the table by his bed. They didn't think much of it. Not then, but when they had to leave when the wind began to change again. And they packed their things in the early morning. They left one photo behind by accident. Just one. Later, someone found it. Maybe the owner of the station. Maybe someone passing through. It made its way into a newspaper, printed on the front page with a caption that made their quiet life sound louder than it was. People saw it. They stared. They judged. They wondered, who are they? They asked, how did they get here? Some were frightened. Some were fascinated. And slowly, softly, the story of Bonnie and Clyde began to spread. But for Bonnie and Clyde, it was just a moment. A small pause in their long journey. A picture taken when the sky was soft and their hands were warm from holding each other. A moment in the light, and even though the world would turn it into something bigger, louder, and more complicated than it had ever been to them in their hearts, it remained exactly what it was, a memory of laughter, of warmth, of belonging, of being seen by each other, even if the rest of the world had only just begun to look. The road which had once carried them, like a gentle current, began to feel different. The quiet stretches grew shorter, the peaceful moments thinner. Towns became sharper in their silence, as if holding secrets just beneath the surface. Bonnie and Clyde, along with Buck and Blanche, tried to keep their days slow and their stops brief. But the picture had traveled ahead of them. People had seen it, and some began to recognize them. In one small town, a man stared just a little too long. In another, the gas station attendant disappeared for a while before returning. Clyde noticed. So did Bonnie. They drove farther each day, slept less, talked less, but never turned on each other. They stayed close, like they always had, just more careful now, more aware that the wind no longer blew as softly as before. Then came the day when quiet truly left them. They had found a little house on the edge of a wooded hill. It looked like no one had been there in years. Ivy curled over the windows, and dust covered the floorboards. But it had walls, and for a time, it felt like a place to rest. They cooked a small meal. They washed their clothes. Bonnie brushed her hair in front of a cracked mirror. Buck cleaned the guns. Blanche wrote a letter she would never send. That night, they played cards by candlelight. They laughed. For just a little while, it felt like the quiet had come back, but the next morning, it was broken, early, before the sun had risen. There were voices outside. Then footsteps. Then a command shouted through the door. "Come out with your hands up." Silence followed. And then the sound of breaking dot. It happened fast. A window shattered. A shot fired. Then more. Bonnie hit the floor. Clyde pulled her behind the couch. Buck shouted. Blanche cried out. Gunfire filled the air like a storm that would not pass. They didn't want to fight. But they didn't want to be taken. When the shooting finally stopped, the house was quiet again. But it wasn't the same kind of quiet. Buck was wounded. Badly. Blanche held him, whispering things no one else could hear. Her hands were trembling. Clyde looked to Bonnie. She wasn't hurt, but her face had changed. They had to leave. Fast. Clyde carried Buck. Bonnie guided Blanche. They got to the car. The tires were hit, but it still moved. Just enough to take them down the hill. Away from the smoke. They didn't know where they were going. Only that they couldn't go back. The road behind them was no longer soft. It had fire in it now. And pain. And loss. But even in that smoke, they didn't let go of each other. They never did. The road that had once held 4 now carried only 2. After the smoke cleared and the dust settled, Bonnie and Clyde were alone again. Buck was gone. Blanche was gone. And the world felt different. Bonnie was hurt. A wound to her leg made walking hard. Each step reminded them that safety was not just a memory, it was a thing they might never truly find again. Clyde carried her when he could. When he couldn't, they moved slowly, step by step. Breath by breath, they found an old farmhouse tucked at the end of a long dirt road. No one had lived there in years. The porch was crooked. The door creaked. But it had 4 walls and a roof, and for a while, that was enough. Clyde made her a bed near the window. He gathered soft things, blankets, old clothes, anything to make her comfortable. He found a chair and sat beside her, keeping watch as she slept. He cleaned her wound with rainwater, wrapped it gently, told her stories to keep her mind away from the pain. About better days. About the time they skipped stones by the lake. About the way the fireflies had danced. Bonnie didn't say much. But when she did, it was always kind. She thanked him for every little thing. For the soup. For the quiet. For staying. Outside, the world kept moving. Newspapers printed stories. The law searched harder. Whispers turned to warnings. But in that little farmhouse, there was stillness. Clyde fixed what he could. He chopped wood. He made meals. He sat beside her and held her hand. At night, he lay near the doorway with a blanket over his shoulders, watching the moon rise, and Bonnie wrote. She didn't write about fear. She didn't write about running. She wrote about love, about quiet, about how even in the hardest places, you can still find peace when someone holds your hand and doesn't let go. They whispered dreams to each other, small ones. Maybe one day they'd find a cabin by a stream. Maybe Clyde would fix cars and Bonnie would grow flowers. Maybe they'd grow old, far away from stories, from papers, from eyes that never saw them clearly. For now, They held on to each other, to the quiet that still lived between them, to the hope that maybe, just maybe, love was enough to carry them a little farther down the road. The farmhouse faded behind them, but its quiet stayed in their hearts. Bonnie and Clyde kept moving, slowly, gently. The road was different now, softer in some ways, heavier in others. They traveled through back roads and open plains, always choosing the paths where no one looked too long. Sometimes they slept in the car, sometimes under the sky. The stars were their ceiling, the wind their blanket. Bonnie began writing again. Not just poems, but little letters she never planned to send. Some were for her mother, some for Blanche, a few even for herself. She folded each one carefully and tucked it between the pages of her notebook. It made her feel less alone. She wrote about the way the moon followed their car at night, about the sound of leaves under their feet, about how Clyde would always check twice that she was warm enough before they fell asleep. Clyde fixed the car as best he could. He tuned the engine with quiet hands. He tightened bolts. He made a small pouch of tools from an old jacket and carried it with him wherever they stopped. He didn't speak much about what was ahead, but he kept moving, kept the car ready, kept Bonnie close. In each place they passed through, they left something behind. A small carving on a tree, a note tucked into the corner of a barn wall. Once, Bonnie left a page from her notebook under a jar on a porch. We were here. We meant no harm. Thank you. They didn't need the world to remember their names. They just wanted to leave kindness behind. A quiet riverbend. Clyde taught Bonnie how to skip stones. Her first one sank. Her second one too. But the third danced twice before disappearing. She smiled. Not bad, she said. He nodded. You'll get better. That night, they stayed by the river, built a tiny fire, shared a piece of bread and half an apple. Bonnie read him one of her letters. Just one. The one she wrote for the road. It said, if someone finds this, know we passed gently. We didn't come to steal the sky, only to rest beneath it. Clyde folded the letter and placed it in his pocket. They didn't know where the road would lead next, but they had made peace with the way it moved, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, always forward, and as long as they had each other, they were never really lost. The road brought them back to a place they knew. Not a town exactly, but a quiet stretch of land with a barn they had once passed during better days. It stood just off the main road, surrounded by tall grass and soft trees that whispered when the wind came through. The barn had changed since they had last seen it. A little more worn, a little more tired, but it still stood, and it still welcomed them, just as it had before. Bonnie and Clyde didn't speak much as they arrived. They moved like people returning home from a long journey, not with celebration, but with quiet steps. Clyde opened the old door slowly. The hinges groaned but held. Inside, the air smelled of dust and memory. Bits of sunlight reached through the cracks in the walls, laying patterns on the floor. Clyde spread out a blanket. In the corner, Bonnie sat down gently, her body still tired, but her eyes soft. They rested that day, truly rested. They boiled water over a small fire just outside the door and made a simple soup with what they had, bread and a few canned vegetables. Bonnie stirred slowly while Clyde sat nearby, carving a small piece of wood into something round and smooth. The sun began to lower. They climbed into the loft. It was cooler up there, and from the open window, they could see the sky turning to gold. The stars would be out soon. They lay side by side on the old boards, wrapped in one blanket, listening to the sounds of night slowly arrive. An owl in the distance. The rustle of dry leaves. The sighing of the barn's old beams. Bonnie whispered, "This place feels like it remembers us." Clyde nodded. He didn't need to say more. The quiet held the rest. That night, they didn't worry. They didn't plan. They didn't look ahead. They simply stayed in the moment, breathing in time with the night. Bonnie traced her finger along the edge of her notebook, but didn't open it. Not yet. She wasn't ready to write about this place again. She wanted to live it first. Let it soak into her like warmth. Clyde held her hand. That was all he needed. Outside, the stars appeared slowly, like soft lanterns in a sky that was ready to hold them. Something in the air was different. Not heavy, not cold, just still, and though neither of them spoke it aloud, they both knew the road ahead was changing, but for this one night, the world had paused and they were safe. Far beyond the barn, beyond the river and fields they had crossed, someone was waiting. A tea began with a conversation in a diner. A man leaned over his coffee and whispered a name. Another nodded. A call was made from a payphone with chipped paint and a quiet dial tone. A voice on the other end took notes. Calm, measured, certain. No one shouted. No one ran. But slowly, gently, the trap was set. The road that had once held freedom now held shadows. Officers waited by trees with cold coffee and maps folded too. Many times, they didn't speak much. They didn't need to. They had been told where to be and when, and so they waited. Meanwhile, Bonnie and Clyde woke with the first light. They gathered their few things, folded the blanket, and closed the barn door behind them. They didn't feel rushed. They didn't feel chased. They just felt the morning pressing gently against their shoulders. The sky was soft, pale blue. The kind of morning that makes a person believe there's still time. They drove slowly with the windows open. Bonnie's hair moved with the wind. Clyde kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting on her knee. They didn't say much, just soft smiles. A shared song hummed between them. They didn't know what waited just ahead, but the world did. Along the edge of a quiet road lined with trees, cars waited in the brush. Men in hats leaned forward. Fingers tightened around triggers. Eyes narrowed. Behind leaves. It had been planned, measured, waited for, not with anger, but with purpose. Bonnie and Clyde drove on, unaware that the road beneath them had already chosen its end. The morning was soft, not cold, not warm, just still. The sky above stretched out in pale blue and silver, and the trees along the road whispered gently, as if they knew what was coming. Bonnie and Clyde drove slowly. No rush in their movements, no fear in their eyes. They had lived with both before, but today there was only calm. A deep breath held between heartbeats. The car hummed beneath them, the tires rolling quietly over the earth. Birds flitted between branches. Sunlight dappled through the trees. Everything around them felt hushed, as though the world had paused just for this. Clyde had one hand on the wheel. The other rested on his leg. He wasn't gripping it tightly. His knuckles didn't strain. He looked straight ahead. Bonnie watched the trees pass. She leaned her head against the seat, her fingers brushing lightly against her notebook in her lap. She hadn't opened it today. She didn't need to. Some words live best inside the heart. They didn't know this was the road. Not exactly. But something in the stillness told them that it could be, and even then, they did not turn around. Along the edge of the road, in the tall grass, and behind the hush of leaves, the world waited. Officers. Quiet men with steady breath. They didn't speak. Their hands rested on triggers. Their eyes stayed still. There was no yelling, no warning. Just the sound of the wind through the branches. Then everything stopped. A bird flew upward, and the air broke dot. It was fast, loud, final. When it ended, the trees went back to whispering. The wind moved again, and the car, once full of soft songs and shared glances, was quiet. Bonnie and Clyde were still. Together, not fleeing, not fighting, just sitting close, the way they always had. Some would call it the end, but to them, it was the place where the road let go of their hands, and gently, softly, the story paused. Time moved forward, as it always does. Towns changed. Roads were paved. New signs went up. Old barns fell slowly back into the earth. But Bonnie and Clyde stayed quietly, gently in the corners of memory. Their names appeared in books, in songs, in whispered stories told late at night. Some told tales of danger and daring. Others focused on the headlines. But there were also stories like this one, simple, soft, and steady. Stories that remembered their quiet walks, their gentle words, their hands finding each other in the dark. The photos faded. The edges curled. But they still existed. And when someone held them, they felt something more than just history. They felt a life shared between two people who had found each other in a world that did not make it easy. Somewhere, someone still reads Bonnie's poems, still looks at her handwriting and wonders what else she might have written. Somewhere, a child hears their story and doesn't imagine criminals, but a girl and a boy who tried to make a life out of what little they had. Together, their love didn't live in shouts. It lived in quiet mornings, in shared soup, in notebooks and wildflowers, and warm hands beneath a blanket of stars. And maybe that's the part of their story that never really ended. Maybe that's what remains, the quiet, the love, and the road that carries their story on gently to the next person willing to listen.